Are you curious how Aperture affects your video? So am I. Let's figure it out together. Serenity. When filming, there's a word you'll hear commonly. It's called aperture. Aperture is very important for a couple of reasons. It's that nice, creamy, blurry background. That's what most people think about when they're thinking about aperture. And that quality is called bokeh. Bokeh can either be good or bad. Good bokeh, imagine a portrait where it's somewhere on the outside and there's plants behind, but they're all blurry and they're a nice, perfect blur around the subject. The portrait looks really good. That's usually what typically people are going for with aperture. But setting up aperture can be tricky because it controls two things: light and the depth of field. And if you remember the triangle that I'm always talking about, there is aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. So aperture, when you open it up, you imagine a little diaphragm circle that's opening bigger, letting in more light, or closing down to let in less light. And a wide aperture would be a lower number, like f1.8. F stands for full stop, stop of light. A narrow aperture would be something like f11, which would be letting in a lot less light. And you might wonder why you keep messing with the light this way. Isn't light king? Why would you want less light? Well, there is something that gets changed when you're messing with the aperture. It also changes the depth of field. So whenever you have a wide aperture, your focus is very shallow. When you have a narrow aperture, then your focus is deep. So this will affect how many things are in focus. So if you have f1.8, for example, then the background will be blurry. But if it's like f11, you'll see a lot more things in the background of focus, which can be distracting from a portrait. But maybe some shots where you want a landscape, you want everything in focus. So you want that aperture very narrow. So the best way I can describe aperture is if you think about an alligator's mouth. So an alligator's mouth is kind of like this, right? So if I'm like this, it's very wide. If I'm like this, it's very narrow. And so with this narrow alligator's mouth, you notice, let's pretend the end of my fingers is the focal length and the depth of field. It's very deep. However, it's like an f11, and so it's a very narrow focus. But a wide aperture would be open big like this, and my hands, I can't really do it very well, but you notice that these parts are closer into the center part here, and so like this distance is shallower. So I would say, this far, shallow, far, shallow. Think about it that way. So you also notice like this, I'm letting in more light. Here I'm letting in less light. That to me is kind of how I'm thinking about it when I'm looking at aperture. There's probably other ways, other methods, but do what works for you. Find a mnemonic that works, or find some kind of memory game or whatever you want to call it that works. So to see this better, I know the alligator mouth thing is a little rudimentary, but actual tests will be the best way to see what aperture does and how it affects you. So let's take a look at that now. All right, let's do some testing now. So right now we're at 1/30th shutter speed. We're at f3.5 and ISO of 100. What we're going to do now is we're going to take the aperture and then I'm going to narrow it down. So it's going to go to f11. Right now it's f3.5, as I mentioned. As that happens, the scene's going to get really dark, and then I'm going to have to bump the ISO. But what I want you to do is take a look at the background here and notice how that changes. That is what is going to change as I tweak the ISO here. So let's go ahead and do this. Now we're going to bump it all the way up to f11. Notice how dark it got. Now let's kick the ISO up to 800. And now take a look at the background. What do you notice? How does it look? Does it look different? Is it more in focus or more out of focus? Well, that's kind of what happens when you tweak aperture. I don't have my better lens on right now, or I wouldn't say better, my prime lens that goes to f1.8. The nice thing with f1.8 is this would be even blurrier behind me. I'm going to go ahead and switch to that now just to give you an example of what that looks like and why we can talk about why you might want to do that. All right, be right back. And we're back. So now I've switched to my prime lens, which is a 22 millimeter, f2.0, not 1.8. But you'll notice the background behind me. It's much creamier, much blurrier. This is that good bokeh. I know it's a different crop, a different angle. I didn't tweak that much. the door's kind of out of the frame now. Let's show you what it would look like. Pan over there a little bit. There's the door. Pan up, pan around, pan back down. Here's the scene again. So what you'll notice is that this is a aperture of f2.0, so it is wider and the background looks blurrier. So why might you want to do this, you might ask? Well, if you think about some of your favorite TV shows, I'm actually going to go back to any kind of sitcom on TV. Whenever they're doing the wide shot where like maybe they're sitting on the couch, there's multiple people in the frame, everything's in focus. Sure, that's fine. But whenever they're maybe sitting in a restaurant or something like that, you'll notice they'll get in close like this and the background's blurry. And then the reason why they do that is so you focus on the subject at hand. If there's too much in the background that's crisp and moving around, it's very distracting and your eyes don't know where to go. If you can just focus on the subject, then you just have one point of focus, one thing to focus on when you're out filming video. The other thing too is if you were out and there was like Christmas lights or those Newton lights, the old school lights hanging from like the ceiling in somebody's patio or something like that. If you did this and you had your aperture nice and creamy like this, the shot would look so beautiful. You'd have somebody talking or somebody in the frame, maybe just moving around, smiling, happy, and just seeing the lights in the background. It'd be almost this starry, romantic effect, something to play with. Sorry, I don't have the footage to show that, but I'm sure you can picture it and you can imagine it. So let's go over the footage we just looked at. So you might notice that whenever we widen the aperture as it approached lower numbers like f1.8 or f2.0, that it let a lot more light in and the depth of field was shallower. Something that could happen when you're doing that is my eyes could be in focus, but let's say back here by my ear isn't in focus. Maybe sometimes that's something you want. Maybe sometimes it's not. So you'll have to think about your shot when you're looking at your aperture and choosing what you want to do. Another thing to think about is I was shooting inside in kind of a dark room. I've got some lighting here, but when you're outside in the sun, f1.8 will overexpose your image big time. You'll be letting a lot of light and blow out that image. So you'd have to crank the shutter speed if you watch my other videos. But you will notice when you crank your shutter speed, your movement might not look as crisp. It'll be kind of frenetic. So you'll have to find another way to solve that problem. There are things called variable ND filters and ND filters. I don't know much about them, but I'll cover them later when I learn more. I've heard that's a technique that the pros use to darken their images when they're outside, but we'll find out later. I don't have one right now. So if anybody has a good recommendation for an ND filter, send it my way. I'm always interested. Or if you just want to send me one. Yeah, it's a bad wink. I don't know. What was that? Okay, back to the video. So you noticed as I approached f11 that it let a lot less light into the scene. And when you're doing that, you might have to crank your ISO because there's a lot less light, but you're going to be introducing noise. So it's another part of that triangle that's a problem that you'll have to solve. It's always this kind of, I don't know if you want to say math, but it's light math, I guess, if you want to call it, because you're just trying to get that triangle, that perfect f-stop of light that you're aiming for. The other thing is the more narrower or wider you notice the depth of field changes. So the background becomes more in focused. When it was f2.0, it was very creamy and blurry, but as I approached f11, things are more clear. And, the little palette is definitely easier to tell, easier to see. So you might have to move further away from that wall. For example, in this room, I can't. I'm butted up against the edge, so I can't move closer to the wall. So you might have to set your aperture. It's kind of all depends on your situation, your scenario. It's something you're going to have to play with. I'm still learning myself. And hopefully, as I go along this journey, maybe I can give some tips or recommendations on distances or something like that I'm like, oh yeah, I'm setting up a scene. It's about 10 feet. Go with this. That's what you want to do. I don't know. It's probably just a feel thing when you get good. So to wrap up, whenever you're messing with aperture, you're changing how much light is let in and your depth of field. If you're trying to focus on an aperture shot, you want to set your aperture, then tweak your ISO and your shutter speed and your lighting to fit the scene. Doing that is going to be tricky, but once you get the shot, you'll get that beautiful shot with that crispy, creamy, beautiful, blurry bokeh in the background, if that's what you want. or you'll get that nice and focused, sharp detail of what's going on in the background. This shot itself took me a long time to set up. You notice even setting these things up and making it pretty because I'm at f3.5, so it's more in focus. I wanted to line things up better so the shot looked more appealing. It's just going to take practice. I still don't like where it's at. But I mean, maybe I'm a critic. I'm too harsh on what I got, but I think this could be better. Maybe there's missing some balance here, more lights. I don't know. It'll be a work in progress, as I grow and I learn more skills and maybe I improve. Maybe it'll get better. It'll get better. It's always a process. So hopefully you learned something today. I know I did. I'm digging this journey that I'm going on, learning every day, learning every week. Every time I pull the camera out, I'm kind of learning something new. Hopefully you're out there learning too. If you would like to leave me some feedback, some comments, what I did right, what I did wrong, or just tips in general, I'm always open and I'll take them into consideration. Thanks for listening and see you next time.